The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the streets dark and slick, reflecting the amber glow of streetlights like liquid gold poured across asphalt. It was nearly 11 hours at night, yet inside the Sterling Room, warmth radiated from chandeliers that cast their light like scattered diamonds across white linen tablecloths. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of seared beef, truffle oil, aged wine, and perfume that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The atmosphere pressed down with a weight that felt both luxurious and suffocating, as if elegance itself demanded a price for admission. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Sweat gathered at the base of Megan Wall's spine, soaking into the burgundy blouse beneath her black vest, mixing with the drugstore body spray she had applied 12 hours earlier and the exhaustion she could no longer hide. She had been moving without rest since her shift began at 10:30 that morning, her feet repeating the same patterns across the dining room floor until the steps felt programmed into muscle memory. Around her, wealthy patrons laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, ordered bottles they would barely touch, raised crystal glasses in toasts that meant nothing beyond the performance. She navigated through all of it with the precision of someone who had trained herself to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the subtle shift in a customer's posture that signaled an empty glass or a finished course. Her lower back ached with a persistent throb, her arches burned inside cheap flats that had been on sale but never fit quite right, and the professional smile she had perfected over 4 years of service work was beginning to feel like a mask that no longer adhered properly to her face. But stopping was not an option. Not when tonight's tips would determine whether she made rent on the studio apartment she could barely afford, or spent another week dodging her landlord's calls and the notice taped to her door threatening eviction. The main dining room of the Sterling Room hummed with its usual Friday night energy. Corporate executives loosened silk ties after deals sealed with handshakes that probably violated several laws. Couples stared at each other across candlelight, desperately trying to resurrect feelings that had died years ago. Tourists snapped photos of artfully plated meals as if they were museum pieces. Megan moved through all of it like smoke, a silver tray balanced on one hand, her movements fluid and efficient, her words polite but never personal, her presence felt only when needed and forgotten the moment she stepped away. She had mastered the art of invisibility. Every good server must, appearing instantly when summoned, vanishing completely when the moment passed. It was survival disguised as service, the ability to exist in a room full of people without anyone truly seeing you. Perhaps that was why she noticed him so clearly. Table 12, positioned in the far back corner, partially concealed behind a decorative wooden screen that separated it from the main dining area. The table reserved exclusively for those willing to pay a premium for privacy, for discretion, for the kind of anonymity that only money could buy in a city where everyone was watching everyone else. Scott Bellamy. She had served him 4 times over the past 3 months, always the same routine. Arriving at precisely 10 sia, never early, never late, always accompanied by 3 men in dark suits who positioned themselves at strategic points around the room. Always ordering the same thing, a dry-aged porterhouse, medium rare, with a bottle of Chateau Margaux from a year that cost more than Megan earned in 2 months. Always speaking in tones too low to overhear. Always tipping exactly 25%, calculated to the dollar. Never raising his voice, never snapping his fingers for service, never causing a disturbance. Yet every employee in the Sterling Room understood that Scott Bellamy's table required the precision and care of a bomb disposal unit. Because in the rare instances when someone brought the wrong vintage or interrupted him during a private conversation, that server was never fired. Nothing so obvious. Instead, their hours were quietly reduced, their sections reassigned to less profitable areas, Their schedule adjusted until they eventually quit without ever understanding why their circumstances had changed. The management never explained. They didn't need to. Megan had learned long ago not to ask questions about men like Scott Bellamy. In a city where the most powerful families built their empires on foundations no one wanted to examine too closely, survival meant keeping your head down, your observations private, and your curiosity buried deep where it couldn't get you killed. She knew he was important in ways that never appeared on tax returns or legal documents, knew the faint Brooklyn accent that occasionally surfaced in his speech came from a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was paid for in blood. Knew the tailored suits he wore cost more than she would earn in 6 months of double shifts. Knew the Rolex on his wrist was real, and the scar across his knuckles told a story she would never ask about. And tonight, Megan knew something was wrong. If this story has found its way into your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing you compelling stories every day. And if it's not too much to ask, would you tell us where you're watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share with us. The first time Megan had served Scott Bellamy was a night in late July when the humidity made the air feel like warm water, and the city seemed to shimmer in the heat. He had walked through the entrance at exactly 10 Wait, neither rushed nor casual, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who never wasted motion. The glass door closed behind him with a whisper, sealing out the summer heat, and every conversation in the VIP section faltered for just a heartbeat. Scott was not handsome in the conventional sense. His face carried too much weight, too much history. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, eyes so dark they appeared black in certain light. Not cold eyes, but penetrating ones, the kind that made you feel exposed, as if he could read everything you were trying to hide. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, moving with the controlled precision of a man who had learned to calculate risk with every step, to never enter a room without knowing all the exits. No one introduced him to Megan. No one needed to. Men like Scott Bellamy didn't require introductions. Their presence announced itself. He sat at table 12, unfolded the white cloth napkin across his lap with movements that felt ritualistic, and didn't glance at the menu. Megan approached with a water carafe, following protocol, though she felt her pulse quicken in a way it hadn't for any other customer. "Good evening. Still or sparkling water tonight?" The familiar question left her lips in the same calm tone she always used, though her shoulders had tightened involuntarily. Scott lifted his head, and for a brief moment that felt much longer, his eyes met hers. Still. No ice. His voice was low, measured, carrying the kind of warmth that made you lean closer without realizing you were doing it. Not aggressive, not threatening, but weighted with authority that required no volume. She turned to pour, already anticipating the order he would give without needing to ask. Dry-aged porterhouse, medium rare, no sauce, extra roasted vegetables on the side, and the Chateau Margaux. The entire exchange took less than 90 seconds. No unnecessary words, no special requests. But Megan felt as though she had just stepped across a threshold into a space without clearly marked boundaries. In the visits that followed, Scott arrived at the same time, ordered the same meal, and always brought the same 3 men who positioned themselves like chess pieces around the dining room. One of them, a man with military bearing and graying hair at his temples, always sat at the table adjacent to Scott's. Vincent. She had never seen him look away from the room for more than 5 seconds. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging every entrance, every exit, every face that passed too close. Scott never asked for Megan by name. But on his second visit, as she approached his table, he said, "You served me last time." Not a question, a statement of fact. She nodded, instinctively smoothing her apron, and immediately hated herself for the gesture. "You're very professional in your work." That was all. No smile, no elaboration. Yet his words stayed with her through the entire shift, a small fire burning in the cold space where compliments rarely reached. After each of Scott's visits, Megan tried to treat him like every other high-paying customer, but she found herself watching him more carefully than she should. She noticed the way he cut his steak with surgical precision, as though even the act of eating required discipline. The way he held his wine glass up to the light before tasting, examining the color like it might reveal secrets. The way his gaze swept the room in a pattern, clockwise, methodical, mapping exits and potential threats with the efficiency of someone trained for violence. Scott spoke very little during his meals, but every word carried weight, purpose. And Megan sensed something she could not allow herself to articulate. This man did not come here only for dinner. Beneath the expensive suits, beneath the calm exterior, something larger moved in the shadows. A machinery of power and violence that operated just out of sight. Scott was the kind of man who projected such control that you could almost believe he needed no protection at all. And yet, he always brought Vincent. For Megan, that was the detail that made her pay attention. That single inconsistency in an otherwise perfect presentation. A man this powerful, this controlled, did not travel with a bodyguard unless the threat was real. He was not warm, not approachable. But in a world as loud and artificial as the Sterling Room on any given night, his silence held a gravity she could not ignore. And then, as always, he finished his meal, left precisely 25%, stood without ceremony, and disappeared into the night as if he had never existed. Yet his presence never truly left the room. And somewhere in her instincts, Megan knew that one day she would have to make a choice between remaining silent like the furniture or breaking that silence and accepting whatever consequences followed. The 5th time Scott Bellamy walked into the Sterling Room, the rain was so heavy that water ran down the restaurant's glass doors in sheets, blurring the streetlights outside into shapeless halos of gold. Inside was warmth, the soft glow of chandeliers, the quiet music of silverware against fine china. Megan knew he would arrive at exactly 10:10. And at precisely that moment, Scott walked through the entrance, his black overcoat glistening with rain, leather gloves on his hands, moving directly toward table 12 as if the entire room were merely scenery painted around him. Vincent followed behind like a shadow, his usual military posture intact, his expression unreadable. But tonight, less than 10 minutes in, Megan realized something was wrong. Not with Scott. With Vincent. The man she had watched maintain absolute stillness through 4 previous visits was moving differently. His hand kept drifting to the inside pocket of his jacket, fingers brushing against something hidden there, then pulling away without retrieving anything. By the 3rd time, Megan could no longer dismiss it as nervous habit. She passed their table the 1st time to refill water, the 2nd time to adjust the candle that didn't need adjusting, the 3rd time to deliver the entree. Each pass was justifiable, brief enough to appear routine, yet long enough for her to observe. Vincent was no longer holding himself like a man on guard duty. His shoulders had drawn inward, protective, defensive. His leg bounced with an irregular rhythm beneath the table. When Scott said something to him, Vincent only nodded without making eye contact, his jaw clenching, muscles working as though he were grinding his teeth against words he couldn't speak. The longer Megan watched, the more certain she became. This was not simply a bodyguard having a bad night. She had worked in service too long not to recognize when someone was hiding something terrible. The 4th time Scott Bellamy entered the Sterling Room, Megan was clearing table 8 when the shift in atmosphere hit her like a change in air pressure before a storm. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they softened, became more careful. Laughter grew quieter. Even the clatter of silverware seemed to diminish, as though the entire dining room had collectively decided to lower its volume by unspoken agreement. She glanced toward the entrance and saw him. Scott moved through the doorway with the same unhurried precision she had observed 3 times before, his charcoal suit fitting him like it had been designed specifically for his frame, which it probably had been. The fabric caught the light as he walked, subtle and expensive, the kind of tailoring that announced wealth without needing to shout. His dark hair was combed back, still damp from the rain outside, and water beaded on the shoulders of his coat like small diamonds before he handed it to the coat check attendant with a nod that contained more courtesy than most people managed with full sentences. Behind him came Vincent and the 2 other men who always traveled in Scott's orbit. Vincent took his usual position at the adjacent table, settling into the chair with his back to the wall, his eyes already beginning their systematic sweep of the room. The other 2 positioned themselves near the bar and the side entrance, casual enough not to alarm the other patrons, obvious enough that Megan understood exactly what they were. Scott walked directly to table 12 without hesitation, without consulting the hostess, because men like him didn't need to be shown where they belonged. He sat facing the room, his back never to the door, and unfolded his napkin with movements that felt ceremonial in their precision. Each gesture was controlled, economical, nothing wasted. Megan finished stacking the plates in her arms and headed toward the kitchen, her heart rate picking up the way it always did when Scott was in the building. She couldn't explain it, this visceral response to his presence, but it was there every time. Something about the way he occupied space, the way other people seemed to orbit around him like planets around the sun, pulled into his gravity whether they realized it or not. She dropped off the dishes, checked her reflection in the steel surface of the refrigerator, tucked a strand of dark hair back into her bun, and grabbed a fresh water carafe. Her hands were steady as she approached table 12, her professional mask firmly in place, but beneath it, her pulse hammered in her wrists. "Good evening, Mr. Bellamy." She kept her voice level, respectful without being deferential. "Still or sparkling water tonight?" Scott looked up, and for the second time his eyes met hers directly. They were darker than she had realized on previous visits, almost black in the low light, and they held the kind of focus that made her feel simultaneously seen and examined. Not in a way that felt invasive or sexual, but analytical, as if he were cataloging information about her the same way she cataloged details about him. Still, no ice. His voice carried that same low warmth that made her lean forward slightly without meaning to. "You remember?" It wasn't quite a question, more an observation delivered with the faintest trace of approval. "Of course." She poured the water with practiced steadiness, even though she was acutely aware of how close her hand was to his. "The porterhouse tonight? Medium rare, extra vegetables, you know the wine." He said it like a statement of fact, not an assumption, and Megan realized he had been paying attention too, noticing that she remembered, testing whether the pattern held. As she turned to place the order, her eyes caught details she had trained herself to observe. The scar across his right knuckles, a raised white line that cut through the tattoo partially visible beneath his cuff. The watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe, she thought, though she only knew because she had seen one once in a magazine, easily worth more than a year of her salary. The way his suit jacket hung perfectly despite the weight she now suspected was a shoulder holster concealed beneath the fabric. But it was his hands that held her attention longest. Strong, weathered hands with calluses that didn't match the manicured nails. Hands that had done more than sign checks and shake hands in boardrooms. Hands that had built something, destroyed something, or both. When Scott spoke, conversations at nearby tables paused mid-sentence. When he lifted his wine glass, the sommelier appeared instantly, hovering at a respectful distance. When his gaze swept the room, people glanced away as if making eye contact might cost them something they couldn't afford to lose. Megan delivered his meal 20 minutes later, setting the plate down with the precision he seemed to inspire. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt more valuable than the tips left by customers who threw money around carelessly. She stepped back, professional distance restored. But something had shifted. She was no longer simply serving a powerful man. She was being observed by him in return, evaluated by someone who missed nothing, who collected information the way other people collected stamps. And as she walked away, Megan felt the weight of his attention follow her across the dining room like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Megan was refilling wine glasses at table 7 when she first noticed Vincent's hand moving toward his jacket pocket. The gesture itself wasn't unusual. People checked their phones constantly, even in expensive restaurants where such behavior was supposedly discouraged. But Vincent had never been one of those people. In the 3 previous visits she had observed, he had remained utterly still, a statue carved from discipline and vigilance, his attention never wavering from the room around him. Now his hand drifted to his inside pocket, fingers brushing against something hidden there, then pulling away as if the object had burned him. 30 seconds later, he did it again. Then again. Each time his eyes darted toward the kitchen entrance, then back to Scott, then down to the table, following a pattern that spoke of anxiety rather than awareness. Megan finished pouring the Merlot and moved toward the service station near the back wall, positioning herself where she could observe both table 12 and Vincent's adjacent position without appearing to stare. She busied herself folding napkins, her hands working automatically, while her attention remained fixed on the bodyguard, who was no longer guarding anything except whatever secret was eating him alive from the inside. Vincent's face glistened with perspiration despite the air conditioning that kept the Sterling room at a consistent 68 degrees. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, leaving a damp streak across his skin. His leg bounced beneath the table in an irregular rhythm that betrayed the nervous energy he was trying to suppress. When Scott said something to him, Megan couldn't hear the words from this distance. Vincent's response was a jerky nod, his eyes never quite meeting his employer's gaze. Something was profoundly wrong. Megan had worked in restaurants long enough to recognize the signs of someone unraveling. She had seen it in coworkers before their shifts ended early with security escorts, in customers moments before they caused scenes, in managers right before they were fired. Vincent wore that same expression now, the look of a man trapped between terrible choices, counting down to an inevitable collision he couldn't prevent. She grabbed a water pitcher and moved toward the tables in Vincent's section, her path casual but calculated to bring her closer without drawing attention. As she approached, Vincent's hand went to his pocket again, and this time it stayed there, fingers curled around something rectangular. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles working beneath his skin, grinding tension into bone. Then she saw the man. He emerged from the direction of the kitchen. Not a staff member, not dressed for the dining room, wearing a leather jacket that was too casual for the Sterling room's atmosphere. His neck was covered in tattoos that crawled up from his collar like dark vines, the kind of ink you acquired in places where the tattoo gun was contraband, and the artist was someone serving 25 to life. His face was hard, angular, with a scar running through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanent expression of menace. He walked directly toward Vincent's table. Megan's pulse spiked. She slowed her approach, pretending to adjust silverware at an empty table 2 spots away, close enough to watch, far enough to appear uninvolved. The tattooed man didn't sit down. He stopped beside Vincent's chair, leaned in as if asking for directions, and in a movement that lasted no more than 3 seconds, passed something from his hand to Vincent's. A manila envelope, thick and rectangular, disappeared into Vincent's jacket pocket with practiced efficiency. Vincent's hand trembled as he accepted it. The exchange was smooth, professional, the kind of handoff that came from experience. But Vincent's face betrayed everything. The relief that flooded his expression was instantly replaced by something darker. Guilt, or perhaps fear, or the terrible knowledge that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The tattooed man straightened, nodded once, and walked back toward the kitchen without another word. He moved like someone who had done this before, who knew how to slip into spaces and vanish again without leaving ripples. Vincent sat frozen for 5 full seconds, his hand pressed against his jacket where the envelope now rested. Then he looked up, scanning the room with sudden paranoia, his eyes sweeping past Megan without registering her presence. She kept her expression neutral, her hands steady on the water pitcher, playing the part of furniture that sees nothing and remembers less. But her mind was racing. She had just witnessed something that wasn't meant to be witnessed. A transaction. A payoff. A betrayal. Vincent reached for his water glass and missed, his hand shaking so badly that his fingers knocked against the crystal, making it ring like a small bell. He tried again, managed to grip it, and downed half the contents in 3 desperate swallows. When he set the glass down, a wet ring spread across the white tablecloth, like blood seeping into fabric. At table 12, Scott continued eating his porterhouse with the same measured precision, completely unaware that the man sworn to protect him had just accepted payment from someone whose neck tattoos advertised a history of violence. Scott cut his steak with surgical care, raised his wine glass to examine the color in the candlelight, his movements unchanged, his expression calm. He had no idea. Megan felt her stomach twist. She had spent 4 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of seeing without being seen, of knowing things without acknowledging them. It was survival. It was safety. It was the only way people like her navigated spaces controlled by people like Scott Bellamy. But standing there, watching Vincent's leg bounce with increasing agitation, watching him check his watch for the 3rd time in 2 minutes, watching him position himself slightly farther from Scott's table than he had ever sat before, Megan understood with absolute certainty that she was watching the prelude to something terrible, and she was the only person in the room who knew. Megan pushed through the swinging kitchen door, the heat from the industrial stoves hitting her like a physical wall. The noise crashed over her, chefs barking orders, pans clattering against burners, the industrial dishwasher roaring through its cycle. But she barely registered any of it. Her mind was spinning, replaying the 3-second exchange she had just witnessed, the manila envelope disappearing into Vincent's jacket, the tattooed man's casual confidence, the tremor in Vincent's hands. She moved on autopilot toward the service station, setting down the water pitcher with hands that had started to shake. A line cook shouted something about Table 14's order being ready, but the words seemed to come from very far away, muffled and indistinct. What had she just seen? The question looped through her consciousness, demanding answers she didn't want to provide, because acknowledging what she had witnessed meant acknowledging what came next, and every possible next step led somewhere dangerous. She could pretend she saw nothing. That was the safest option, the one that kept her invisible, kept her employed, kept her alive. In places like the Sterling Room, serving men like Scott Bellamy, the first rule was simple. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, you knew nothing. Blindness was survival. Silence was currency. People who violated that rule disappeared, sometimes from their jobs, sometimes from the city, sometimes more permanently than that. But Scott didn't know. He was sitting 20 feet away, finishing his porterhouse with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, completely unaware that the man sworn to protect him had just accepted payment from someone who looked like he had killed before, and would kill again without hesitation. Megan pressed her palms against the stainless steel counter, trying to slow her breathing. The metal was cold beneath her skin, grounding her, pulling her back into her body. She could call the police. Anonymous tip. Payphone 2 blocks away. Let them handle it. But what would she say? A bodyguard accepted an envelope from a man with tattoos. That wasn't evidence. That was speculation. And by the time police responded, if they even took the call seriously, whatever was going to happen would have already happened. Men like Scott existed in spaces where police intervention came too late or not at all, where the law bent around them like light around a black hole. Besides, involving police meant questions, statements. Her name in a report that people like Scott could access, that Vincent's employers could access. It meant painting a target on her back that would never wash off. She grabbed her order pad from her apron pocket, the small spiral-bound notebook that had become an extension of her hand over 4 years of service work. Her fingers fumbled with the pages, flipping past orders for medium-rare steaks and gluten-free pasta, past wine requests and dessert modifications, until she found a blank page near the back. This was insane. She was a waitress. She carried plates and poured wine and smiled through exhaustion for tips that barely covered her rent. She wasn't equipped for this. She wasn't trained for this. She had no business inserting herself into whatever deadly machinery was grinding towards Scott Bellamy right now. But her hand was already reaching for the pen clipped to the pad's cover. Because the alternative, walking back out into that dining room, refilling water glasses, pretending everything was normal while watching a man die. That felt worse than any danger she might invite by speaking up. That felt like a death of its own, a permanent erosion of whatever piece of herself still believed she mattered, that her choices carried weight, that she was more than furniture in other people's stories. Her handwriting was barely legible, letters shaking across the page like a seismograph recording an earthquake. Your bodyguard set up the ambush. You were never leaving alive. She stared at the words, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The message was melodramatic, borderline absurd, the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in upscale restaurants in the middle of a Friday night shift. Scott would probably think it was a prank, or a threat from a disturbed customer, or the ravings of someone who had finally cracked under the pressure of service industry brutality. But what if he didn't? What if some instinct told him to take it seriously? What if those 5 seconds of extra caution were the difference between walking out of the Sterling room alive or being carried out in a body bag? Megan tore the page from her pad with shaking hands, the perforated edge catching and ripping unevenly. She folded it once, then twice, creasing the paper with fingers that felt numb and distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She was really going to do this. She was going to walk back into that dining room, approach table 12, and hand Scott Bellamy a warning that would either save his life or end hers. There was no middle ground, no safe option where she walked away unscathed. The moment she placed that note in his check folder, she would cross a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. She would become visible to people who preferred their help invisible, noticeable to men who eliminated problems before they became threats. Every instinct she had cultivated over years of survival screamed at her to throw the note away, to go back out there and play her part, to stay small and silent and safe. But her hands weren't listening to those instincts anymore. She tucked the folded note into her apron pocket, smoothed down the fabric, and took one long breath that did nothing to slow her racing heart. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see Scott at table 12, his profile calm and controlled, his wine glass catching the candlelight. He looked like a man who had no idea he was about to die. Megan pushed through the door, back into the dining room where chandeliers cast their golden glow over white linen and crystal, where wealthy patrons laughed and clinked glasses and pretended violence didn't exist in their carefully curated world. She walked toward table 12 with legs that felt unsteady, carrying a warning that would change everything. Megan's legs carried her across the dining room floor with a steadiness that contradicted the chaos, screaming through her nervous system. Each step felt deliberate, choreographed, as if she were walking across a stage toward a finale she hadn't rehearsed. The folded note burned in her apron pocket like a live coal, its presence impossible to ignore despite being no larger than a credit card receipt. She grabbed the leather check folder from the service station, the movement automatic after thousands of repetitions. Her hands assembled the components with muscle memory. Scott's itemized bill printed on cream-colored paper, the ornate pen with the Sterling Room's logo embossed in gold. But when she slid the folded note inside, tucking it beneath the bill where it would be the first thing he saw when he opened the folder, her fingers trembled badly enough that the paper rustled. Table 12 was 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. Scott was finishing the last of his wine, swirling the dark liquid in his glass with practiced appreciation before raising it to his lips. Vincent sat at the adjacent table, his posture rigid, his hand moving compulsively to his jacket pocket every 30 seconds, as if confirming the envelope was still there. The two other guards maintained their positions near the bar and side entrance, relaxed but alert, unaware that the threat wasn't coming from outside, 5 feet away. Megan's professional mask was cracking. She could feel it slipping, the practiced smile faltering at the corners, the calm composure she wore like armor showing stress fractures. Her pulse hammered in her wrists, in her throat, behind her eyes. Every server instinct she possessed screamed that she was about to violate the fundamental rule of her profession: never, under any circumstances, involve yourself in the customer's business. She reached table 12. "Your check, Mr. Bellamy." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though she could hear the faint strain beneath the words, like a string pulled too tight. Scott looked up, and for the third time that night, his dark eyes met hers. But this time something in her expression must have registered, because his gaze sharpened, narrowed slightly, reading her the way she had watched him read rooms, calculating, assessing, searching for the detail that didn't belong. The eye contact lasted a heartbeat too long. 2 heartbeats. 3. Megan felt exposed, stripped of her invisibility, seen by someone who made his living reading people for lies and weakness and threat. She broke the gaze first, setting the check folder down in front of him, with hands that she willed to remain steady. The leather made a soft sound against the white tablecloth, quiet as a whisper, loud as a gunshot in her heightened state of awareness. "Thank you," Scott said, his voice carrying that same controlled warmth. But now there was a question beneath it, an awareness that something had shifted in the space between them. Megan stepped back, her training dictating the appropriate distance, but she didn't walk away. She stood there, waiting, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought he might hear it. Scott reached for the folder with unhurried precision. His fingers, strong and scarred, lifted the leather cover. His eyes dropped to the contents. She watched his face change. It happened in stages, each lasting no more than a second. First, confusion. A slight furrow between his brows as he registered the folded paper that wasn't supposed to be there. Then focus, his entire attention narrowing to the handwritten words as he unfolded the note. Then something that looked like ice settling over his features, every muscle in his face going still in a way that was more terrifying than any expression of anger. His eyes scanned the message once, twice. "Your bodyguard set up the ambush. You were never leaving alive." When Scott looked up, his gaze found hers immediately, locking on with an intensity that felt physical. The question in his eyes was clear and sharp. "Are you certain?" Megan gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, her throat too tight for words. Scott's demeanor transformed in an instant. The relaxed sophistication vanished, replaced by something coiled and dangerous, a predator recognizing the presence of another predator. He folded the note with deliberate care, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stood in one fluid motion. "Vincent." His voice was casual, almost pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "We're leaving. Kitchen exit." Vincent's face drained of color. "Sir, the car is out front." "Kitchen exit. Now." The command left no room for negotiation. Scott was already moving, not toward the main entrance where Vincent had presumably arranged his ambush, but toward the back of the restaurant, through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen and the service alley beyond. Vincent rose from his chair, his hand instinctively moving to his jacket pocket, to the envelope that had just become evidence of his betrayal. His eyes swept the room with sudden panic, searching for something, a signal, a person, a way to salvage what was rapidly falling apart. The two other guards moved instantly, flanking Scott as he walked, their relaxed demeanor evaporating into sharp professionalism. They hadn't heard the conversation, but they read Scott's body language like a text written in a language they had studied for years. Megan watched Vincent's face cycle through expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally something that looked like resignation. He touched his ear, where she now realized he wore a nearly invisible earpiece, and mouthed something silent. A warning, an abort signal, a message to whoever was waiting outside the main entrance with guns and instructions to make sure Scott Bellamy never left the Sterling room alive. Scott disappeared through the kitchen doors without looking back. His guards followed. The dining room continued its normal rhythm, wealthy patrons laughing and eating and drinking, completely unaware that something significant had just collapsed around them. Vincent stood frozen for 3 seconds. Then he bolted. Not toward the kitchen, not after Scott, but toward the side entrance where the third guard had been stationed. He moved fast, knocking against a chair, drawing startled looks from nearby tables. The guard at the entrance moved to intercept him, but Vincent was already through the door, vanishing into the night. Megan's knees went weak. She reached out, steadying herself against table 12, her hand pressing into the white linen where Scott had sat moments before. The dining room tilted slightly, her vision swimming, adrenaline flooding her system now that the immediate crisis had passed. She had just saved a man's life, or ended her own. The gunfire started 40 seconds after Vincent fled through the side entrance. 3 sharp cracks that cut through the ambient noise of the dining room like a knife through silk. For a moment, the sound didn't register. It was too out of place, too disconnected from the reality of white tablecloths and crystal chandeliers. Some patrons kept eating, kept talking, their minds refusing to categorize the noise as anything dangerous. But Megan knew. She had grown up in neighborhoods where gunshots were as common as car alarms, where you learned the difference between fireworks and firearms before you learned multiplication tables. Then came the screaming. It erupted from the street outside, high-pitched and panicked, followed by the sound of car tires screeching against wet pavement and more gunshots, 5, 6, 7 in rapid succession, overlapping until they blurred into a continuous roar of violence. The dining room exploded into chaos. Patrons lurched from their chairs, some dropping to the floor, others rushing toward the back of the restaurant away from the windows. A woman knocked over her wine glass, red liquid spreading across white linen like arterial blood. A man shouted into his phone, his voice shrill with fear. The maitre d' was yelling something about staying calm, but his own face had gone white, his hands shaking as he gestured people away from the entrance. Megan stood frozen at table 12, her hand still pressed against the tablecloth, her mind struggling to process what she had just set in motion. The note, the warning, Scott's sudden exit, Vincent's panicked flight, and now gunfire in the street that had been meant for someone who was no longer there. She had changed the outcome. The ambush had collapsed. But the violence hadn't been cancelled. It had only been redirected, scattered into the night like shrapnel from a grenade. More screaming outside, the sound of shattering glass. Then sirens, distant but growing closer, the wail of police cars and ambulances converging on the Sterling room from multiple directions. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a silence that felt worse than the noise. In that silence, Megan could hear her own breathing, ragged and too fast, and the muted sobbing of a woman crouched beneath table 9. Vincent was gone. Scott was gone. And whatever had been waiting outside the front entrance had found no target, only chaos and witnesses, and the approaching wail of law enforcement. The police arrived within 3 minutes, flooding through the entrance in tactical gear, weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to stay down, stay still, hands visible. Megan sank into a chair at table 12, her legs finally giving out, and watched as uniformed officers swept through the dining room, securing the space, checking for wounded, separating staff from patrons. An ambulance crew rushed past the windows, heading toward something Megan couldn't see from her position. She caught a glimpse of blood on the sidewalk outside, dark and wet in the streetlight, and her stomach lurched. Detectives arrived 20 minutes later, once the scene was secure and the immediate threat had passed. They moved through the restaurant methodically, interviewing witnesses, taking statements, photographing the dining room as if violence had somehow stained the elegant space even though all the blood was outside. A detective in a rumpled suit approached Megan where she still sat at table 12, his notepad already open, his expression professionally neutral. "You work here?" "Yes, I'm a server." "Name?" "Megan Wall." He wrote it down with mechanical efficiency. "Did you see what happened?" This was the moment. The choice between truth and survival, between testimony and silence. Megan had spent the last 20 minutes preparing her answer, editing it, stripping away everything dangerous until only the safest version remained. "I heard gunshots from outside. Everyone started panicking. I got down behind the bar until it stopped." It wasn't a lie exactly, just an incomplete truth, a story with all the crucial details carefully excised. "See anyone leave through the front entrance right before the shooting?" "The dining room was busy. People were moving around. I don't remember specifically." Another non-answer, another careful sidestep. The detective's eyes studied her face, looking for the tells that separated honest witnesses from those hiding something. Megan kept her expression tired but cooperative, the face of someone traumatized by violence but with nothing useful to offer. "What about that table?" He gestured to table 12, to the check folder still sitting where Scott had left it, to the empty wine glass and the perfectly cut remains of the porterhouse. "Someone was sitting here when it happened?" "A regular customer. He left maybe 5 minutes before the shooting started, paid his check and went out the kitchen exit. Some people prefer to avoid the crowds at the front entrance." True enough. Leaving out the warning, the note, the betrayal she had witnessed. "You get a name?" He paid cash, never gave a name. The detective wrote something in his notepad, his pen scratching against paper. "We're going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow. Give a formal statement." "Of course." He handed her a card with a case number and a phone number and moved on to the next server, the next witness, collecting fragments of truth that would never quite assemble into the complete picture. Megan sat alone at table 12, surrounded by the aftermath of violence she had helped redirect, and understood with perfect clarity that she was no longer invisible. Scott had seen her, had read the note she wrote with shaking hands, had trusted her warning enough to change his exit, to survive an ambush that would have killed him. Vincent had seen her too, in those final seconds before he fled, had registered her presence at table 12, had understood, or would understand soon, that someone had warned Scott, that the trap had been exposed. And whoever had sent the tattooed man with the envelope, whoever had paid Vincent to betray his employer, whoever had positioned gunmen outside the front entrance, they would be looking for answers, looking for the leak, looking for the person who had disrupted their carefully orchestrated execution. Megan's hands were steady now, but it was the steadiness of shock, of a mind that had moved past panic into a strange calm that she knew wouldn't last. She had saved Scott Bellamy's life, and in doing so, she had signed something. A contract written in violence and witnessed by people who operated in shadows where forgiveness didn't exist, and forgetting was impossible. The dining room was emptying now. Patrons escorted out by police, staff giving statements and contact information. Through the window, Megan could see forensic teams marking, evidence on the sidewalk, photographing blood spatter and bullet casings. Someone had died out there tonight. But it hadn't been Scott. And that single fact, that one changed outcome, had just made Megan Wall visible to people who preferred their enemies dead and their witnesses silent. 3 days after the shooting, Megan stopped sleeping. Not from nightmares, though those came too, flashes of gunfire, Vincent's panicked face, blood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling room. But mostly she stayed awake because sleep meant vulnerability, meant closing her eyes in a studio apartment with locks that could be picked in 30 seconds, on a street where footsteps echoed at 3 a.m, and she could no longer tell which ones were pedestrians and which ones were threats. The Sterling room had closed temporarily for investigations. The official story in the news was a gang-related shooting. Wrong place, wrong time. 1 casualty. A man with prior convictions found dead in the alley with 3 bullets in his chest. No mention of Scott Bellamy. No mention of a foiled ambush. Just another statistic in a city where violence was common enough to fade from headlines within 48 hours. Megan had given her formal statement at the police station, repeating the same carefully edited version she had told the detective. She saw nothing useful, heard gunshots, took cover, couldn't identify anyone. The detective had looked at her the way cops look at witnesses they know are lying, but without evidence to contradict her story, he had let her go with instructions to call if she remembered anything else. She wouldn't call. She would never call. Because the truth was a death sentence, and silence was the only currency she had left to buy herself time. Now she sat in her apartment on the 4th night, the television playing soundlessly, casting blue light across walls that felt like they were closing in. Every car that passed outside made her flinch. Every creak of the old building settling made her heart rate spike. She had stopped going to the corner store, stopped checking her mail, stopped doing anything that required her to be predictable or visible. The knock came at 9:47 p.m. 3 measured raps against the door, neither aggressive nor tentative, the knock of someone who expected to be answered. Megan's breath caught. She stood slowly from the couch, every muscle tense, her mind calculating distances to the fire escape, to the kitchen where a knife sat in the butcher block, to the bathroom where the window was too small to climb through, but might offer concealment. Megan Wall? A woman's voice, calm and professional. My name is Elena. I work for Scott Bellamy. I'm here to talk, nothing more. You're not in danger from me. The words should have been reassuring. They weren't. Because people who worked for men like Scott Bellamy didn't show up at your door to deliver good news. Megan moved to the door, looked through the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, early 40s, wearing a black suit that looked expensive even through the distorted fisheye lens. Dark hair pulled back severely, minimal makeup, the bearing of someone who had been military or law enforcement, or something else that taught you to stand like violence was always an option but rarely necessary. How did you find me? Megan's voice came through the door, steadier than she felt. Scott finds everyone he needs to find. Are you going to let me in, or should we have this conversation where your neighbors can hear? It wasn't really a choice. Megan unlocked the deadbolt, the chain, the secondary lock she had installed 2 days ago, and opened the door. Elena stepped inside with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering unfamiliar spaces, her eyes sweeping the apartment in a single efficient glance that cataloged exits, windows, potential weapons. She moved to the small kitchen table and set down a leather briefcase, then turned to face Megan with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile, just professionally neutral. You saved his life. Elena didn't waste time with preamble. Scott wants you to know that he's aware of what you did, and more importantly, why it mattered. Megan closed the door, but didn't move closer. I didn't do anything. We both know that's not true. Vincent is dead, by the way. Found in a dumpster in Gary, Indiana yesterday morning. 3 bullets, professional execution. The people who paid him don't appreciate failure. The information landed like a physical blow. Megan had suspected Vincent wouldn't survive his betrayal, but hearing the confirmation made it real, made her complicit in a chain of violence that now included a body in a dumpster. "I don't want any trouble," Megan said, hating how small her voice sounded. Too late for that. Elena opened the briefcase and removed something small, setting it on the table with a soft click of metal against wood. "You're already in trouble. You witnessed a conspiracy to commit murder. You interfered with that conspiracy. The people behind it know someone warned Scott. They'll figure out it was you eventually. Question is, what happens when they do?" Megan's eyes dropped to the object on the table. A ring. Gold, heavy, with an ornate seal carved into the face. An eagle with wings spread, clutching something she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "Scott is giving you a choice," Elena continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining a business transaction rather than a life-altering decision. The first option, disappear. New identity, new city, enough money to start over somewhere far from here. We have people who handle this kind of relocation. You'll be safe, anonymous, invisible. You'll also be alone, cut off from everything you know, looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. She gestured to the ring. Second option, you put that on. It's Scott's personal seal. Anyone in his world sees it, they know. You're under his protection. Untouchable. But protection isn't free. You'd be working for him. Training. Learning. Becoming someone useful in ways you can't imagine yet. It's not safe. Nothing in Scott's world is safe. But it's power. Agency. The ability to act instead of hide. Megan stared at the ring, her mind cycling through implications, consequences, futures she couldn't fully envision. The first option was survival, but it was also erasure. Becoming a ghost. Trading one kind of invisibility for another. The second option was terrifying and unknowable. A door leading into darkness. How long do I have to decide? You already know your answer, Elena said, not unkindly. You knew it the moment you wrote that note. People who choose safety don't insert themselves into situations that could get them killed. You could have stayed silent. You didn't. Megan thought about every time she had made herself small. Every time she had swallowed words that needed to be spoken. Every time she had disappeared into the background while life happened to other people. People who mattered. People who took up space. 4 years of carrying trays and forcing smiles and accepting tips like they were favors instead of earned wages. 28 years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. She walked to the table and picked up the ring. It was heavier than it looked. Solid gold, warm from sitting in Elena's briefcase. The seal caught the light, and she could see now that the eagle was clutching a key in one talon and a sword in the other. Knowledge and power. Protection and danger. Megan slid the ring onto her right hand. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. As if this moment had been inevitable from the second she decided to write that warning, instead of staying silent. Good, Elena said, closing the briefcase. Pack a bag. 1 suitcase, essentials only. You won't be coming back here. Your landlord will find a check for 6 months' rent, and a notice that you've relocated for family reasons. Your other jobs will receive similar notices. As of now, Megan Wall the waitress doesn't exist anymore. Then who am I? Elena smiled for the first time, and it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone welcoming a recruit into something that would either forge them or destroy them. That depends entirely on how well you survive the next 8 weeks. The compound sat 40 miles outside the city, hidden behind tree lines and unmarked roads that appeared on no GPS system Megan had ever used. Elena drove in silence through the pre-dawn darkness, the Mercedes gliding over asphalt that transitioned to gravel that eventually became dirt. No signs marked the entrance. No fence announced a boundary. just a subtle shift in the landscape where cultivated normalcy gave way to something more deliberate, more controlled. The main building looked like a converted warehouse, all concrete and steel, utilitarian in a way that suggested function, overform. Floodlights illuminated a training yard where obstacle courses cast long shadows in the artificial glare. In the distance, Megan could hear the rhythmic crack of gunfire, controlled, methodical, nothing like the chaotic violence outside the Sterling room. Elena parked near the entrance and killed the engine. "Before we go inside, you need to sign something." She produced a document from her briefcase, multiple pages of dense legal language that Megan's exhausted brain could barely process. Words jumped out at her: non-disclosure, liability waiver, acknowledgement of risk, binding arbitration, termination clauses that dealt with death rather than resignation. "This says I can't sue if I'm killed during training," Megan said, her voice flat with disbelief. "It says a lot of things. Read it if you want. But it all amounts to the same conclusion. You're choosing to enter a world that operates outside conventional legal structures. Scott protects his people, but he also expects commitment. Absolute loyalty. Once you sign this, there's no walking away because you changed your mind or things got too difficult. You finish the training, or you don't leave here at all." The threat was delivered without malice, just cold fact. Megan thought about the ring on her finger, the weight of gold that had felt like power 3 hours ago and now felt more like a shackle. But she had already made her choice. She had made it when she wrote the note, when she slid the ring on, when she packed her single suitcase and walked away from the only life she had ever known. She signed on the last page, her signature looking small and fragile beneath the blocks of legal text. Elena took the document, slid it back into her briefcase with the finality of a door closing. "Welcome to your new life. Try not to die in the first week." Inside, the compound was exactly what Megan expected. Harsh fluorescent lighting, concrete floors, the smell of sweat and industrial cleaner. Elena led her through corridors that felt more like a military installation than anything civilian. Past rooms where she glimpsed heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams, weapons racks mounted on walls, training mats that had seen violence and blood, and bodies hitting them hard enough to leave permanent impressions. They stopped outside a windowless office where a man sat reviewing footage on multiple monitors. He looked up as they entered, and Megan felt her breath catch. Marcus was built like something designed to break things. 6'4", broad through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of lean muscle that came from functional strength rather than aesthetic vanity. His face was weathered, lined with scars, one cutting through his left eyebrow, another tracking along his jaw. His eyes were gray, cold, assessing. Former military, Megan thought. Special operations, probably. The kind of man who had killed people in countries whose names appeared in classified reports. "This is her?" His voice matched his appearance. Rough, economical, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Megan Wall," Elena confirmed. "Scott's newest project." Marcus stood, moving with the economical grace of someone who knew exactly how much force their body could generate and exactly how to deploy it. He circled Megan slowly, studying her the way a butcher might study a cut of meat, identifying weaknesses, calculating yield. "You look soft," he said finally. "Weak, undisciplined. Scott says you're observant, that you noticed things trained professionals missed. That's good. Observation keeps you alive. But observation without the ability to act on what you see just makes you a witness to your own death." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I'm going to teach you 3 things. How to hurt people, how to avoid being hurt, and how to think like the kind of person who does both without hesitation. Some people wash out in the first week because the physical training breaks them. Others make it further before they realize they don't have the psychological capacity for this work. A few make it all the way through and become useful. Which one are you?" "I don't know yet," Megan said, because lying to Marcus seemed like the fastest way to get herself hurt. He smiled, and it was the expression of someone who appreciated honesty, even when it revealed weakness. At least you're not stupid. That's a start. Training begins at 0500. You'll learn hand-to-hand combat, weapons proficiency, surveillance detection, counter-surveillance, threat assessment, psychological manipulation, and about 40 other skills that will either save your life or get you killed depending on how well you internalize them. You'll hate me by the end of the first day. By the end of the first week, you'll want to quit. By the end of the first month, you'll understand why Scott chose you. He moved to a weapons locker, opened it to reveal an arsenal that would have impressed a small military unit. Violence has a language, he said, removing a combat knife and setting it on the desk between them. Vocabulary, grammar, syntax. Most people only know how to scream in that language, loud, ineffective, emotional. I'm going to teach you to speak it fluently. To whisper threats that people believe. To execute violence so precisely that it looks like art. Megan stared at the knife, at her reflection distorted in the blade's polished surface. She looked small, uncertain, out of place. What if I can't learn? Marcus's expression didn't change. Then you'll die badly when someone who speaks the language fluently decides you're a liability. Scott doesn't keep dead weight, and the ring on your finger doesn't make you invincible. It makes you a target for anyone who wants to hurt him. You either become dangerous enough to survive that attention, or you become a cautionary tale I tell the next recruit. Elena touched Megan's shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle. I'll leave you to get settled. Barracks are down the hall, second door on the right. You have 4 hours until your first session. I suggest you sleep, eat, and mentally prepare for the worst physical experience of your life. She left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Marcus was still watching Megan with those cold gray eyes, measuring something she couldn't identify. Last chance to walk away, he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Once training starts, the only way out is through completion or body bag. Megan thought about Vincent in a dumpster in Gary, Indiana, about the blood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling room, about 4 years of invisibility and exhaustion and powerlessness, about the choice she had already made, irrevocably, the moment she decided her voice mattered more than her safety. I'm ready, she said, and didn't recognize her own voice. Harder, colder, belonging to someone who had started dying the moment she picked up that pen and started writing a warning that changed everything. Marcus nodded once. We'll see. Get some rest. Tomorrow I start teaching you how to become someone worth killing. The first week nearly killed her. Marcus woke her at 0500 with a bucket of ice water dumped directly onto her face while she slept. Megan came up gasping, disoriented, her body protesting before her mind had fully engaged. He was already at the door, his voice carrying the same flat authority it would maintain for the next 8 weeks. 5 minutes. Training yard. If you're late, you run an extra 5 miles. She learned quickly that Marcus didn't make idle threats. On the second day, when she arrived 90 seconds late because her legs had seized up from the previous day's punishment, he added 5 miles to her morning run without comment, without negotiation. She ran them on muscles that screamed with every step, tasted blood in her throat by mile 3, and collapsed face first into gravel at the finish line. Marcus stood over her, unmoved. Get up. We haven't started the real training yet. The physical conditioning was designed to break her. 5-mile runs before dawn. Obstacle courses that left her hands raw and bleeding. Hours holding stress positions until her muscles trembled uncontrollably. Sparring sessions where Marcus put her on the mat so many times she stopped counting, stopped trying to avoid the pain, and started learning to absorb it, to move through it, to use it as fuel rather than surrender. Pain is information, Marcus told her during week 2, after she took an elbow to the ribs that left her gasping. It tells you what's damaged, what needs protection. but it doesn't tell you to quit. That's your mind betraying you. Your body can handle far more than your mind believes. Learn to ignore the parts of your brain that lie to you about your limitations. By week 3, Megan stopped being surprised by how much punishment her body could endure. The constant ache became baseline normal. The exhaustion became something she operated through rather than something that stopped her. Her hands, once soft from carrying trays, developed calluses from climbing ropes and gripping weapons. Her shoulders broadened. Her body fat percentage dropped until she could see muscle definition she hadn't known existed. But the physical transformation was only the foundation. The real training happened in the tactical classroom, where Marcus taught her to weaponize observation. "You noticed Vincent's betrayal because you were watching," he said during a session in week 4. "But you were watching passively, collecting information without framework. I'm going to teach you to watch actively, to read patterns, to identify threats before they materialize." He showed her videos of crowded spaces, restaurants, airports, train stations, and made her catalog everything. Who was carrying bags that didn't match their clothing? Who was checking exits instead of watching where they were going? Who was sweating in air-conditioned spaces? Who made eye contact too frequently or avoided it entirely? Whose body language suggested concealed weapons? Whose micro-expressions betrayed anxiety that their words tried to hide? "Violence announces itself if you know what to listen for," Marcus explained. Elevated breathing, dilated pupils, muscle tension in the shoulders and jaw. People preparing to hurt someone else undergo physiological changes they can't fully control. Your job is to spot those changes before the violence manifests. They drilled scenarios endlessly. Marcus would bring in operatives Megan had never met, plant them in a room full of compound personnel, and give her 60 seconds to identify the threat. At first, she failed constantly, choosing wrong, missing obvious tells, overthinking innocuous behavior. But gradually patterns emerged. Her success rate climbed. By week 5, she could walk into a room and identify the 3 most dangerous people present within 30 seconds. Weapons training started in week 4 and consumed hours every day thereafter. Marcus began with handguns, grip, stance, sight alignment, trigger control. Megan's hands shook the first time she fired a Glock 19, the recoil traveling up her arms, the sound overwhelming even through ear protection. By week 6, she could draw and fire from concealment in under 2 seconds, putting 3 rounds center mass at 15 yards without consciously thinking about the mechanics. They moved to knives, to improvised weapons, to the brutal efficiency of empty-hand techniques designed to incapacitate or kill, rather than simply control. Marcus taught her where to strike to collapse a trachea, to rupture a kidney, to sever the femoral artery. He taught her that violence, when necessary, should be decisive and overwhelming, that hesitation was the gap where people died. "You're not fighting for points," he said during a particularly brutal sparring session in week 7. "You're fighting for survival. There's no referee, no rules, no fairness. You exploit every advantage, every weakness. You don't stop until the threat is neutralized or you are." But perhaps the most valuable training happened in the manipulation sessions, where a woman named Dr. Reeves, a psychologist who had worked for agencies whose acronyms were classified, taught Megan how people lied and how to make them tell the truth. "Everyone has tells," Dr. Reeves explained in week 5. "Verbal and nonverbal. The key is recognizing the baseline, how someone behaves when they're comfortable, and then identifying deviations. Increased speech rate can indicate anxiety. Decreased eye contact can suggest deception. But these aren't universal. Cultural factors matter. Individual psychology matters. You need to calibrate for each person." They practiced with compound personnel, who were instructed to lie about specific details. Megan learned to ask questions that created cognitive load, that forced liars to construct narratives in real time. She learned to watch for the micro-expressions that flickered across faces before conscious control reasserted itself. she learned that silence was a weapon, that discomfort made people fill space with information they hadn't intended to reveal. By week 7, Megan could extract information from trained operatives who knew exactly what she was doing and still couldn't prevent themselves from betraying the truth. The final test came in week 8. Marcus woke her at 0300, earlier than usual, and led her to a scenario room she had never entered before. Inside, the space had been configured as a high-end bar, complete with bottles and glasses and mood lighting. 6 people occupied the room, compound personnel playing roles. "One of them is planning to kill you," Marcus said. "You have 20 minutes to identify who, how, and when. If you're wrong, the exercise ends with you failing. If you're right, you pass." He left her alone with 6 strangers, any one of whom might be a threat. Megan entered the bar, her senses immediately sharpening. She ordered a drink she wouldn't consume and began cataloging details. The woman at the corner table who kept her purse positioned between herself and the door. Defensive positioning. Low threat probability. The man at the bar whose jacket was tailored too precisely to conceal anything bulky. Possible, but his body language was relaxed, conversational. The couple near the window who were arguing in low tones, distracted, focused on each other, not scanning the room. But the man reading a newspaper at the booth in the back. His eyes moved too quickly, scanning rather than reading. His left hand stayed beneath the table. His breathing was elevated, and when the bartender dropped a glass, he flinched toward the sound with the reflexes of someone trained for threat response. Megan walked directly to his booth and sat down across from him. "Your left hand is on a weapon under the table," she said quietly. "Probably a knife rather than a gun because this is close quarters and you want quiet. You're waiting for me to turn my back, probably when I leave, planning to follow me out and execute in the parking lot where there are no witnesses. You've been watching the door since I arrived, timing my patterns, and your breathing elevated when I approached because you're operating in an uncertain timeline now." The man stared at her for 3 seconds. Then he smiled and brought his left hand up, revealing the training knife with the red tip that would have marked her as dead. "Correct on all counts. Marcus said you were getting sharp. I didn't believe him." Marcus appeared from a door Megan hadn't known existed, his expression as unreadable as ever. 8 weeks ago, you were a waitress who noticed one detail. Now you're someone who reads entire environments as threat matrices. You've earned the ring you're wearing. Tomorrow you find out if you can use these skills outside a controlled environment. Megan stood, her body tired but no longer broken, her mind operating with a clarity she had never experienced in her old life. The trembling waitress who had approached table 12 with a warning note was gone, dissolved in 8 weeks of calculated brutality. Someone else looked back at her now from the mirror behind the bar. Someone harder. Someone dangerous. Someone who had finally learned to be seen. The penthouse occupied the 42nd floor of a building whose ownership records were buried behind so many shell corporations that tracing them would take federal investigators months. Megan arrived with Elena at 9:00 p.m., stepping out of the elevator into a space where wealth and danger mingled with the casualness of old friends who had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city stretched out below like a circuit board, lights glittering against the darkness. Inside, perhaps 60 people moved through the open floor plan, men in suits that cost more than luxury cars, women in dresses that announced power rather than decoration, servers carrying champagne that probably cost more per bottle than Megan used to make in a week. But these weren't the Sterling Room's clientele. These people carried violence in their eyes, in the careful way they positioned themselves with backs to walls, in the bulges beneath tailored jackets that suggested weapons within easy reach. This was the underworld made flesh, the machinery of organized crime dressed in Armani and drinking Dom Perignon. "Remember," Elena said quietly before they entered, "you're not here to be liked. You're here to prove you belong. That means reading the room, identifying threats, and demonstrating that you're not someone to be tested. She handed Megan a black dress that fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, which it had been, measured and tailored, during her final week at the compound. The fabric moved like liquid, elegant but not restrictive, allowing full range of motion if violence became necessary. Megan's hair hung loose for the first time in years, dark and glossy, no longer pulled back in the severe bun of her service days. She wore the gold ring on her right hand where everyone could see it. They entered together, and Megan felt the shift in attention immediately. Conversations didn't stop, but eyes tracked her movement, cataloging, assessing, searching for weaknesses. She recognized the examination because she had learned to perform it herself. These people were predators evaluating a new presence in their ecosystem, determining whether she was competitor, prey, or something else entirely. Scott stood near the windows, surrounded by 4 men Megan recognized from intelligence briefings at the compound. Rival bosses, tentative allies, people who would smile and shake hands while calculating how to destroy each other if circumstances required it. He saw her enter and nodded once, acknowledgement without summoning her, letting her navigate this space on her own terms.
Megan accepted champagne from a passing server, more as prop than refreshment, and began moving through the room with the same observational precision Marcus had drilled into her for 8 weeks. She cataloged faces, matched them to names and affiliations she had memorized. The man near the bar with the bratva tattoos visible on his knuckles. The woman by the fireplace whose designer handbag was positioned to allow quick access to whatever she carried inside. The 3 men in the corner whose body language suggested they were having a conversation that would end badly for someone not present. "I don't recognize you." The voice came from her left, male, accented, carrying the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Megan turned to find a man in his 50s, distinguished in the way that expensive grooming and better surgeons could manufacture. She recognized him from her briefings. Victor Constantine, arms dealer with connections to Eastern European networks, known for testing new players in Scott's organization. "That's because we haven't met," Megan said, her tone pleasant but not warm. "You're wearing Scott's ring. That makes you someone worth knowing." Victor's eyes traveled over her in a way that was deliberately invasive, meant to establish dominance, to see if she would defer or deflect. "What do you do for him? You're too pretty to be just an analyst." The insult was casual, thrown out like bait to see how she would react. 8 weeks ago, Megan would have smiled tightly and excused herself, would have shrunk from the confrontation. Now she held Victor's gaze and let silence stretch for 3 seconds, long enough to establish that she wasn't intimidated, short enough to avoid seeming aggressive. "I do what needs doing," she said finally. "Same as everyone here, except I don't pretend it's about anything other than survival and power." Victor's expression shifted slightly, surprise perhaps, or reassessment. "Direct. I like that. Most of Scott's people dance around answers. Most of Scott's people have been in this world long enough to learn the value of ambiguity. I'm new enough to still appreciate honesty." "New," Victor repeated, tasting the word. "How new?" Megan recognized the question for what it was, an attempt to establish her inexperience, to position her as someone who could be manipulated or dismissed. She took a slow sip of champagne, using the pause to calculate her response. "New enough that people underestimate me, experienced enough to make them regret it." Victor laughed, genuine amusement breaking through the predatory assessment. "Scott always did have an eye for talent. Tell me, what did you do before this? What makes a woman take a ring from a man like him?" The question was designed to extract information, to find the leverage point that could be exploited later. Megan had been warned about conversations like this, seemingly friendly exchanges that were actually intelligence-gathering operations disguised as small talk. "I noticed things other people missed," she said, offering truth that revealed nothing useful. "Scott values observation. So here I am." "Observing? And what do you observe about me?" Megan let her gaze travel over Victor with the same clinical assessment he had applied to her earlier. You're wearing a Breguet watch, 1775 edition, worth about $300,000. Your suit is chiton, bespoke. Your shoes are John Lobb, custom last. You're displaying wealth because in your world, wealth is power. But your left shoulder sits slightly higher than your right, which suggests you're carrying a weapon in a shoulder holster and haven't adjusted your posture to compensate. That tells me you're more concerned with accessibility than concealment, which means you expect trouble tonight. Victor's smile had frozen. Around them, nearby conversations had quieted slightly, people tuning in to an exchange that had just become interesting. You also checked the exits when you entered, Megan continued, her voice conversational. You're positioned with your back to a load-bearing wall, not a window, and you haven't drunk from the glass in your hand, which means you don't trust the servers. So what I observe, Victor, is someone who's operating in enemy territory and trying very hard to pretend otherwise. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then Victor threw his head back and laughed, the sound carrying across the penthouse, drawing more attention. Scott! He called toward the windows. Where did you find this one? She just read me like a technical manual. Scott turned, his expression neutral, but his eyes holding something that might have been approval. I didn't find her. She found me. There's a difference. Victor raised his glass in a toast. To observation, then. And to knowing when you're outmatched. He leaned closer to Megan, his voice dropping. Word of advice. People in this room will test you because you're new and because you're a woman. Some of them will assume you're Scott's mistress or his secretary playing dress-up. Don't correct them with words. Correct them the way you just corrected me, by showing them exactly how wrong they are. He walked away, and Megan felt the weight of attention shift. The room had been watching that exchange, measuring how she handled someone with Victor's reputation. She had passed some invisible test, crossed a threshold from curiosity to something approaching respect. The rest of the evening unfolded in similar exchanges. Conversations that were really negotiations, questions that were really tests, pleasantries that concealed threats. Megan navigated all of it with the skills Marcus had beaten into her, reading body language, identifying alliances, deflecting manipulation with surgical precision. By 11 p.m., she had established herself as someone who couldn't be dismissed or underestimated. People remembered her name. They asked for her observations. They treated her like an asset rather than decoration. When the gathering began to thin, Scott approached her near the windows where the city glittered below like scattered diamonds. Elena tells me you passed every test at the compound. Marcus says you're one of the fastest learners he's trained. Tonight confirms it. You handled yourself well. I survived, Megan said. That's different from handling it well. No, Scott said quietly. Surviving is exactly what handling it well looks like in this world. Most people who enter it die quickly because they can't adapt. You adapted. You saw Vincent's betrayal when trained professionals missed it. You're standing here now when 8 weeks ago you were serving tables and trying to be invisible. He gestured toward the windows, toward the city below. You saved my life, Megan. That creates a debt, but more importantly, it revealed something about who you are. You chose to act when staying silent would have been safer. That choice brought you here. Megan looked out at the city, at the lights stretching to the horizon, and thought about the studio apartment she would never return to, the waitress uniform she would never wear again, the version of herself who had trembled while approaching table 12 with a warning she had no business delivering. I didn't join your world, she said finally. I stepped into it because staying in mine meant dying slowly, one invisible shift at a time. But standing here now, knowing what I know, capable of what I've learned, this isn't your world anymore, Scott. It's mine too. I claimed space in it. I earned the right to be here. Scott smiled, and it was the first genuine expression she had ever seen on his face. Good. People who think they're guests in my world don't survive. People who understand they're players. They become dangerous, and dangerous is exactly what you need to be. He left her alone at the windows, standing 42 stories above a city that no longer felt like the place she had grown up. Below, People moved through their lives unaware of the machinery operating above them, the networks of power and violence that shaped outcomes they would never see. Megan looked at her reflection in the glass, the black dress, the loose hair, the gold ring catching light, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The trembling waitress was gone, erased by 8 weeks of calculated brutality and one impossible choice that had changed everything. She had been invisible for 28 years. Now she was the shadow people should fear. And that transformation, from furniture to predator, from observer to player, felt more real than anything she had ever experienced. She belonged here, in this world of sharp edges and sharper people, and she was just beginning to understand exactly how dangerous she could become.